Go.
Audio.
Great. Good morning, everybody. We are just about ready to get started with our program this morning. Just going to give people one more chance to get logged on and to get settled as we begin our program. So, good morning, everybody. We are just about. Oops. Okay. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining us here today. We are truly delighted to welcome you to this discussion as part of the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325. Our discussion today is titled Pitches for Peace, Rethinking Inclusive Peace Processes. So I'm Sarah Taylor. I'm a director at Inclusive Peace, where I focus on international policy and on women, peace, and security, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. We have an innovative and interactive program lined up, and I am delighted to kick us off and to get this discussion started. The program will begin with remarks from Her Royal Highness, the Countess of Wessex. Your Highness, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, good day to everybody. Thank you very much indeed. I'm really delighted to have been invited to address you before this event, Pitches for Peace, gets underway. Everyone attending this meeting today knows and understands the genuine importance and need for our mission. And my hope is that these discussions will form the basis for moving the dial towards real progress in supporting the objective of increased participation by women at peace negotiations around the world. In spite of small inroads made on women, peace and security agenda, there remains a significant implementation gap in the meaningful participation of women in formal peace processes. The biggest hurdle to overcome seems to be that nearly every country affected by conflict around the world is dominated by male leadership, where political exclusion is rife and the opportunity for women to succeed is frustrated. Patriarchy is to blame for this. But although men may generally be the perpetrators of these conflicts, they are also the answer to countering it. And if men in leadership positions can be helped to see the merit in encouraging widespread female representation, step by step, inclusion will become a reality, and the peace agreed stands, as we know, more chance of lasting. The issue, of course, is not should women be involved. The case for doing so is irrefutable. The issue is how to ensure they are involved at the right level, not to be there just to make up the numbers, but to be actually heard and taken seriously, and to do so with the protection and dignity that each and every one of these peace builders deserves, and nothing less. The excuse that there are not the women available who have the right skill set or experience to be able to contribute is often heard. The very fact that I'm speaking before Emily Coity, Betty Begombe, and Yasmin Oforan is evidence to the contrary. We all know there are plenty of women from all over the world who are highly skilled and knowledgeable, as well as women whose informal roles place them equally as capable as their male counterparts. So how do we ensure women can take part? During a recent event I attended, a seasoned and highly respected male negotiator suggested that women should stop looking to be invited and just walk through the door. Perhaps easier said than done. However, examples of women successfully taking the lead in advocating for peace and not waiting for invitations to the table have been evident, such as in Colombia, the Philippines, and Liberia. In order to achieve our collective aim, there is no doubt that much more effort is required on all sides. I therefore look forward to learning from you how peace processes can be more representative of women and other marginalized groups, can be more enriched with the female voices of wisdom, and can be more assured of delivering the kind of just and sustained peace that every soul deserves. Let's make today's event a line in the sand, where 20 years of inching forward becomes a launch pad for real progress towards the inclusion that we know is right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Your Royal Highness, for those words of welcome and of substance. Indeed, women are walking through the doors, and some of them are joining us today, which we're really delighted about. I'd like to give a couple of framing points, additional framing points for our discussion today. This is, as we all know, the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325, and we all know the statistics. We know that the numbers of women, as Her Royal Highness has just pointed out, the numbers of women meaningfully engaged in formal peace processes have stagnated, if not decreased, despite some notable representation. But more than that, we know that too often our efforts are focused on bringing women into broken peace processes. While there is ample recognition in research, in policy, that the traditional incremental linear sequenced approach to peace is not working, as a peace building community, we are still searching for new ways to transform these traditional approaches, both conceptually and operationally. Too often, these new approaches get lost in translation from theory to practice, and women, peace, and security remains a key example, despite our 2 decades of normative development. So, in addition to needing creative ways to operationalize policy frameworks, we're currently in a period of deepening national and global polarization, in which formal peace processes, e.g. in Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, are on hold or dysfunctional, and international powers address their differences through confrontation instead of cooperation. This has, of course, been compounded by the COVID-19 crisis and the global responses to it. We have yet to fully understand the impact of the pandemic on efforts to build and sustain peace, but we know that they are gendered. At Inclusive Peace, we are rethinking inclusion and peace with a new initiative focusing not only on inclusive processes, but on inclusive and just outcomes. And we invite you to join us as we grapple with how we can build up longer-term inclusion patterns, making this change the starting point of long-term self-reinforcing efforts to build inclusive societies. And this is why we're so excited about this event today. We are delighted to partner on this discussion, as we believe that the peace builders joining us today are up to the task of both aspirationally and practically addressing these issues. So those are my framing points. We've worked to create, on the technical side, we have worked to create a program that is a little different than a typical Zoom meeting, something that is more interactive and that includes the audience as well as our panelists. So we will first have pitches from our 4 peace builders. They have 3 minutes each to present a problem they have identified, a pitch to address that problem, and to lay out what they see as the potential long-term impact of this idea. Then we will have some reflections from and discussion with our expert panelists, who will assess each pitch on an evaluation criteria of innovation, practicability, affordability, and the potential to provoke change. And then we will have the opportunity for you, the audience, to also evaluate the pitches on those same criteria. That means that we will have a 10-minute break in the middle of the program for you to enter your thoughts on a link that will be shared on our YouTube channel. I will then present the results of that audience assessment, and we will have some additional reflections on those assessments. And finally, I'm delighted that we will have a global perspective from our partners on this event, with comments from senior representation from the United Nations, from the United Kingdom, from Mexico, from Kenya, and from Norway. So all that being said, we are on time. And it is my pleasure to turn to the first of our amazing women peace builders, who will present their pitches for peace. So we are starting with Emily Kowiti, Youth Representative on the JME Commission of South Sudan. Emily will be pitching on the augmentation of implementation prospects for peace agreements. So Emily, if you are ready, it's my turn to hand over to you. Emily, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction. I'm presenting on how we can augment implementation prospects for peace agreements, focusing on the transition stage of the peace building phase of of a peace agreement. That is, if the understanding is that we have, once we are trying to deal with conflict, there is the first phase where we deal with getting a ceasefire. And then after that, we build peace where we have a transition stage and then a consolidation stage. But my focus is on the transition stage, and this is based on my experience. And to define it further is to say that it's an implementation phase of a negotiated peace agreement, and which precedes a consolidation phase. Now, the critical issue that I want to address is the slow and poor implementation of Track 1 peace agreements due to lack of political will, amplified by the absence of detailed, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound commitments or activities drawn from the agreed provisions, and which also have matched estimated costs backed by pledges by all actors for implementation. And this not happening prior to the implementation stage. Now, this issue, once it's happening, the hallmarks, how it manifests is, one, there is lack of political will from the parties, or some will call it political capital. Two, there is lack of time, pledge, and remittance of support by relevant partners. And then there is massive mismanagement of the few resources that are available for implementation through corruption, and sometimes diverting them to issues that are outside the agreement in place. Then fourthly, failure to meet set transitional deadlines. And finally, later on, cost estimation for implementation that excludes participation of critical stakeholders such as women, youth, and the broader civil society. Now, how do we address this issue? I propose that we make development of specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound, or one would say SMART, those who do M&E know this, strategy with matching implementation cost estimates and attendant contingency costs as part of Track 1 negotiations and the resultant peace agreement. Secondly, we ensure that the implementation of the transition agreement with that strategy that I've talked about is preceded by attainment of an obligation or pledges agreement by all actors, and that matches cost estimates, yet has clearly set out conditions for such support. And then thirdly, to ensure that the development of this strategy, the negotiation of the pledges agreement, and dissemination, even monitoring and evaluation of the same includes women, it includes youth, it includes civil society, it includes all the non-political stakeholders in the peace negotiation. The outcome desired here is a significant attenuation of lack of political will, more inclusive implementation during transition, increased accountability during implementation, timely yet cost-effective funding of transition agreements, and finally, timely and quality implementation of transition agreements. Thank you. That's the end of my pitch.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that presentation and for being so on time, in addition to laying out some of the ways in which we will, you can build in accountability into the formal Track 1 processes as an idea. I'm going to turn to our next peace builder, who is the wonderful Betty Bigombe, who is a technical advisor on the South Sudan peace process, but has also a wide-ranging set of experience herself on numerous peace processes. So, Betty, if you can join us, there we go. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings to everybody, and I hope you're all well during these very difficult times. And thank you very much for including me into this very important discussion. I will focus on the region, specifically Africa, which I know best, although I've had experiences in other continents. I will start by talking about the problems, And specifically, I would like to talk about selection of chief mediators. And then I'll talk about the consequences of having chief mediators who cannot deliver. And then I will talk about probably the pitch, the recommendations of what I think should work. What I've seen largely in Africa is selection of chief mediators are usually former heads of states or people who have held high-level positions. This is because they have political clout, but they have absolutely no experience in mediation. To make it worse, they come also with a team that lack the knowledge of mediation. They come with teams who are recruited based on maybe people who are looking for jobs, a nephew who maybe is articulate, but not necessarily that they know the art and science of mediation. So when you get such leaders, and I've seen this in Africa, sometimes they don't even know the country context. Oftentimes, well, besides not knowing the art and science of mediation, lack of knowledge of the region, and specifically the fact that because they do not know, they're looking for their own success. And in the process, they're not even mindful about the feelings of the parties. A mediator, among other things, needs to be a good listener, somebody who is patient. I've seen these former heads of state, some of them lose their temper and they throw the whole exercise in turmoil. They're not even mindful about the inclusivity of the process. Let me give South Sudan as an example. The mediation centered on power sharing. But if women were included, and I'm talking about women who articulate women issues, they would talk about all these other social issues that affect their communities. And this is not the case. Consequently, the agreement which is reached is not sustainable. I've talked because oftentimes I've heard them give deadlines and appealing to the people to sign this agreement is good for you without understanding how, when you're mediating, you must know that the people you're dealing with are heavily scarred. You need to know that they're very egoistic. They come in to win. And therefore putting yourself in a position that can listen patiently of what their issues are when they're convinced that you understand where they're coming from and what their issues are, then it's easy to get them to the table and they will sign a peace which is sustainable. But if they're forced, if they're coerced, the outcome is that the agreement, and I've seen many who have been signed, which have been signed, the agreements which are signed is for public consumption, not because they are convinced about the agreement. So what do we do about this? And in this case, I want to address you, the international community. Oftentimes, you're the funders of these peace talks. And being funders, you can also decide on what should be done. Okay, I know that for a long time, there's been consistency about including women, but what kind of women are they included? Okay, to qualify for funding, yes, the factions will take women onto their teams, but are they women who articulate issues of women? Oftentimes, this is not the case. What I therefore would like to suggest is that we have to be strong about the selection about mediators. Not only that, I think that we should develop a criteria of who mediators should be, what kind of qualifications they should have. And if need be, we would even go further to make sure that they get some kind of training, induction. I know this is taking place in some places, but oftentimes these trainings are very, very short. How can you get a former head of state to sit down and agree to be trained? They will brush it off. So at least the teams that they come with, to make sure that their CVs are looked at and that they have experience and that they can help and have influence in the process. So training, let me call it orientation, is critical in making the process succeed. But like I said, it also needs a personality who understands the context where these parties are coming from. I think that is what I have to say in 3 minutes. You don't have much. There are so many other issues that I could put on the table for discussion today, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. Yes, 3 minutes is a very restricted amount of time, but I really appreciate, particularly given your substantial experience, including your role in FemWise, the African Women Mediator Network, as well as your other experience, laying out exactly what it is that's challenging about the inclusion aspect of mediation, not least of which is that political sensitivity and political will issue that you raise about how do you convince a senior mediator to go through a really substantive training. So thank you for laying out some of those criteria of how to mitigate that. I am delighted to turn to our next peace builder, Yasmin Urhani, who is an expert on peace and security at the EU Youth Cooperation Hub, and is also a founder of We Belong. Yasmin, do you have your...
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me today. And I follow up with the points, in very important points that Betty fostered. And I would like to give a point of view as an external negotiator and focusing on initial negotiations. Because external negotiators that go on conflict-affected countries are often European, and then when they organize conferences, these exclusive conferences, there is often a gender approach that lacks. I would just mention very quickly the Palermo conference organized by Italy, my country of origin, where Libyan women and their voices has been sidelined completely until a very last minute when an advocacy campaign was led by a youth-led organization, and then Libyan women have been included very last minute. So my pitch would be to co-create these conferences with the youth from both conflict-affected countries, but also diaspora youth. And when I mean diaspora youth, I mean refugees, but also immigrant sons and descendants, such as me, who work and have an intersectional approach. So intersectionality should be the guiding principle, because as we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Resolution, we're also celebrating the anniversary of the Youth, Peace and Security Resolution. And so when we talk about including women and youth, let's also reflect on being a young woman and then burden. And so I would suggest in this co-creation of conferences to set quota for youth and women to be defined along with the advisory young expert from both conflict-affected countries and diaspora, and have the European partner or the external partner to put a coercive point or a condition set these quota. And then finally, to establish a youth focal points alongside a role for diaspora youth to serve as an advisory capacity to the EU delegations in country where the EU is involved in peace processes. And this is the same for the European member states. And I believe that the cultural sensitivity of youth from diaspora can be an innovative approach and an added value to the benefit of mediation. So in the short term, the outcome will be to ensure that at the table there is not only men, but also youth and women. And especially there will be this process of co-leadership, having an intergenerational approach and addressing the grievances and finding a more representative compromise on the mediation effort. And then in the long term, peace processes, as we know, would last longer, but then also youth would feel to be included and more likely to foster peace rather than being engaged in violence, and because they would feel politically represented. So we would have an ownership in the process. And last but not least, European peace mediators or external mediators would gain in legitimacy by involving the diaspora youth and adopting an intersectional approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yasmin. I am delighted that we really do have, I was just reviewing the various stages and the various recommendations that you're all making. And I think we're going to come out of this with some recommendations for every stage and aspect of peace processes writ large. We have one more pitch to hear before we turn to discussion with our expert panel. We will now hear from Daniela Soto Pito, the coordinator to the Indigenous Regional Council of Cauca in Colombia. We will hear some recommendations, a pitch from her based on her significant experience in her region. Daniela, the floor is yours.
Buenos días, saludarlos, agradecer por esta oportunidad. Me voy a enfocar sobre todo en el tema de la participación en los procesos de paz. Tiene que ver con hemos visto un problema grande en términos de la participación de las mujeres y de jóvenes en los diálogos y procesos. En ese sentido, la propuesta tiene que ver con generar unas mesas de diálogo territorial, ya sea de manera presencial o de manera virtual, en las cuales se pueda debatir con la población civil, específicamente con las mujeres y los jóvenes, sobre los avances de los debates y de los diálogos del acuerdo de paz. En ese sentido, pues se propone que los delegados se den por región, que conformen una mesa nacional diversa, inclusiva, con participación pues de mujeres y jóvenes, que ayuden a supervisar y hacer pedagogía también frente a esos acuerdos, y que para esto, si se hace de manera presencial,
for this purpose, this must do face-to-face, dynamic agents from national government, and the guarantee has to guarantee the focal points on internet. At least 50% of those who are going to participate this way should be women. And LGBT and rural urban representatives. The armed forces should also participate in this dialogue. They would have to try to integrate with civil society to discuss security. The civil society, especially youth, may acquire knowledge about what has been done and know when they're going to go to the negotiating table to be able to make their own contributions and provide advice. That is basically the proposal. This can be regional, departmental, so they should have their representatives to receive all the information and bring them to the main negotiating table so that civil society, especially young people and vulnerable groups, can have their voices heard. We also propose other tools, such as interactive pages, web pages, websites, where civil society can also engage. Individuals can have their voices heard. We also propose other tools, such as interactive pages, web pages, websites, where civil society can also engage.
Great. So apologies to Daniela and to the audience in terms of our technical challenges in terms of interpretation for the first.
Individuals can have their voices heard. We also propose other tools.
Great. So sorry, we're just having one or two technical challenges. So apologies for the slight technical challenges that we had with the interpretation. I do just want to review to make clear, because Daniela really does have a fantastic pitch. And so I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to hear exactly what it is. So her idea focuses on the challenge of the insufficient participation of women and youth in dialogues and peace processes, of course. And so what she's proposing is these territorial dialogue tables, which could be implemented either in person or virtually through meetings like this, which would allow consultation with members of communities in various regions, municipalities, to engage, to enable constant communication and debate regarding whatever is happening at a more formal, more elite, more exclusive negotiation process. The tables, as she envisions them, would have at least 40% women, young people, LGBT, Indigenous, et cetera, Afro-descendant, rural, urban. There would also be representatives of whoever the armed actors and parties to the conflict are. And there would be an official delegate legitimized by the community who would collect the concerns and proposals of these communities from each dialogue table and feed them into those more elite and exclusive processes. The government as well would provide online space to continue to update communities about what is happening in the dialogues and provide an additional fora to continue the conversations raised at those dialogue tables. And this is her way of looking for an outcome that is that entails the broad participation of young people and women. It enables or it fosters increased legitimacy because of this ongoing dialogue. And it is actually a benefit in and of itself in terms of post-agreement legitimacy and engagement and knowledge from a far broader swath of the population in terms of the components of the agreement and what is necessary to implement it. So, apologies for those technical challenges. However, I'm really delighted. If you look at the way that our peace builders have laid out their pitches, we have Daniela looking at this initial phase, how you get dialogue from a far broader swath of the population. You have Yasmin focusing in these initial stages on donors and their responsibility, again, with an issue of legitimacy. Betty with her criteria for mediators and this sort of actor in the process. And then in implementation, we have Emily with her proposal that the implementation plan, that monitoring and evaluation should be brought into the actual negotiation phase. And even if that takes a little bit longer, in that negotiation phase, you then have a way to address political will, accountability, and funding that again brings in a far more inclusive group of people and larger legitimacy for the broader population. So that is my very, very brief summary of our pitches. We will now turn to our expert panel. So I am absolutely delighted that our expert panel is comprised of Teresa Whitfield, who is the Director of Policy and Mediation Division at the UNDPPA, but she also, of course, has extensive experience, including in Latin America, on supporting, facilitating peace processes and creating processes that are in fact more effective and more inclusive. We are also joined by Hannah Tete, who is the Special Representative of the SG Secretary General to the African Union. She is the head of the office of the UN Office to the African Union. She's also the co-chair of FemWise and has also extensive experience mediating, facilitating peace processes and being a champion on inclusion. And then, of course, we have Dr. Tanya Poffenholz, who is the Executive Director of Inclusive Peace and is well known for her extensive work, not only in facilitating peace processes and working for inclusion, but also her groundbreaking work on how we understand inclusive processes and inclusive outcomes. So with all of that being said, I'm also going to invite Emily back to the conversation. And our esteemed panel will provide some initial thoughts on Emily's proposal. And we will then have a discussion with Emily and our experts. So is Emily, if Emily could bring your, there we go. Okay, excellent. So Teresa, I will turn to you for your initial reflections on Emily's proposal.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and great to be with all of you today. I know we're quite tight for time. So my first thought was thank you so much, Emily, for such a clear proposal. And thinking about the different criteria, the one that really struck me on this is the potential for change, because this, if this were feasible in different circumstances, then this is a game changer because it addresses the structural roots of implementation and carrying a peace process forward, both in terms of political will and in terms of resources. But precisely because of that, it's very challenging in many circumstances and goes, I think, to the point about what the intention of parties and party supporters when they sign a peace agreement, and what kinds of pressures are there and what kind of political will to actually deliver on it, and how much even the external supporters want to see a peace agreement and check a box and go home, and how much they're willing to invest for the long haul. So a really fundamental proposal, going right to the heart of some very tricky issues around the reasons that people sign and the relative weight of an agreement versus the longer process of implementation and what that means. And I think I meant to start off with, and I'll just put it on the table now, because listening to all of the pitches, and then I just wanted to flag Sarah's point she made almost in passing at the beginning, but the importance of all of these pitches playing into the ultimate goal of inclusive societies rather than just inclusive processes. So needing to take that very long-term look through, and that if this was possible to implement, given political will and resources, then this would contribute it. I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you. Hannah, SRSG Tete, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, thank you very much, Emily, for your pitch. I found it quite interesting, and I think you made a couple of valuable points, that whatever the quality of the peace agreement, how successful it will be is determined also by the quality of implementation. Now, I noted that your pitch towards inclusivity involved talking about how various stakeholder groups would be involved in developing what would be the SMART targets for implementation and the timelines. I think that beyond that, however, there's also the issue of building legitimacy within the community, the larger public and the larger community. So it means not just involving a group in this process, but making sure that there's continuous engagement with the larger society, letting them understand what is going on so that you have a greater constituency for support for the implementation of the agreement. I also think that with regard to the point that Teresa just made about what are the motivations of the actors in signing a peace agreement, well, that always varies. And the fact of the matter is that some of them just basically want to have the international community off their back. So they will sign an agreement, agree to begin to start an implementation process, hoping that that diverts the attention from the other things that they want to get on and do. And so it also goes to the quality of partnerships between those who are involved in developing these benchmarks, and at the same time, those who are equally involved in making sure that the support is given, both financial and technical, to allow these processes to run out. But I thought it was an interesting pitch.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Tanya.
Yes, thank you. I think also I agree, of course, with Teresa and Tanya. It's an interesting picture, and especially at first it looks very detailed in terms of, oh, is that not too technical? Is it ignoring the politics behind? But I think it doesn't. It look into that. But I think at the same time, of course, the problem is, as Teresa and Hannah already highlighted, is like where the political will and the public support, and the political will of whom? So what we know from comparative sort of case studies is really it's the political will of those in power, of course, and those who sort of lose and gain power, plus the public support to the process that counts at the end. So my question to Emily would be like, how are these tricky factors, besides sort of monitoring provisions, both sort of in a kind of formal way, and here we have a lot of examples from other countries, and I think Colombia comes into my mind, where exactly this detailed monitoring of indicators, of criteria, of provisions has been provided and is still ongoing in a quite creative way, but still they're facing the same problem in terms of political will and slow implementation that you, Emily, described, besides having exactly what you suggested. Second, the Philippines has already introduced for the Mindanao Agreement a civil society sort of parallel monitoring system where these groups come together and monitor. And again, they're also challenged by the lack of political will and also the changing political constellations. So how would you bring in sort of the political conditions and also the constant ensuring of public support to the agreement that would be an add-on to your SMART criteria? That's my question to you, Emily. Thank you.
All right, Emily, your reflections, responses for our group here.
Well, I had mostly comments, and thank you very much for those generous comments to my pitch. I want to start by saying that when I thought of this, yes, there are interests of people, of those who are behind the actors, in this case, the parties. But the assumption then I had here is that this is happening at a stage where the political negotiations have happened. People have agreed on provisions, and now it's time to unpack. In our context, South Sudan's context, what we have had is unpacking those provisions into a matrix. And my thinking is that that is inadequate, that matrix has to be unpacked further into process in terms of activities that would be required to make one single provision achieved, and costing that. Because then what we have seen over time is actors, first of all, by the time we go to negotiating peace agreements, the thought process of a government has been disrupted. Many people have come in and they do not even understand governance. And it's at this point that one has an opportunity to take them through thinking systematically about what has to be done. Let me give an example. If it says that certain sets of legislations have to be reviewed, it has to be understood what it takes to review a legislation in a particular context in that country, and who is involved, and what would be an inclusive process look like, and imagining it at that stage during the negotiations after all the provisions have been agreed, the political discourse has happened, and then costing that, so that now when the transition starts and it's time to implement, it's very hard for politicians to say that to tell people that all this this has to be done differently, or this is not supposed to be done this way, because that will already have been thought through. And the people who are beneficiaries of this peace agreement, the wider citizenry, is able to follow and knows that this process has not gone according to the way it was expected to go. And the process is simple, and maybe this particular state does not require resources. when it's not unpacked to that extent, then politicians or parties can easily say that there is no money, even for something that does not require financial resources. And that is the thinking I was looking at. And I think that then responds to the question of public support and political conditions that require. I think that was Tanya who asked the last question on political conditions and public support to the process, because then you will have a more detailed peace agreement that is more easier for everybody to follow, and politicians will find it hard to fool anybody. But also partners who say that they are interested in peace will then find it either easy to commit resources because things are more clearer and it's easier to cost them than when the process is not unpacked and they do not know what it's like in a particular context and what they can support. And it would take even a shorter time to develop this kind of strategy than if it's left to be developed by the same parties who renege on commitments later on during the transition. I think it would save a lot of time. Hope I've answered the question.
Thank you. I'm just going to give our expert panel another 30 seconds each, if you'd like to reflect on that, because I think there's this really interesting sort of set of tensions in Emily's proposal that I'm wondering that, you know, Teresa started off by raising exactly this issue that it would be such a game changer, but that's exactly why it's so difficult to implement. I'm just wondering if you could each give just one more brief reflection on whether Emily has addressed your questions or whether you have suggestions, additional suggestions for her.
Thank you. I think in one universe, Emily has exactly addressed what should be done, and it would be great if we can do so. The problem is the other universe of all the swirling interests, and as Hannah put out, the different kind of reasons that people sign agreements, and even some of the external backers where, you know, we all want to see a peace agreement somewhere, and we know the risk that an agreement is signed and national attention can go back to kind of power politics and who gets what piece of the pie, and international attention can go on to something else. And that's the problem. But what Emily's putting forward is exactly right and principled and correct if we actually want to see consistent implementation of agreements.
If I may. Well, I'd like to add to what Teresa just said. I think that a point that Emily raises, especially with regard to the resources involved in implementing a peace agreement, is something that we somehow take for granted, that it is the international partners that will fund this process. I think it's important for us to move away from that perception, not because there should not be support to peace processes, but usually these long-standing conflicts are resource-based, about sharing the spoils from significant national resources that result in generating considerable amounts of revenue. So some of these benchmarks, if we are going to make this more innovative, should be towards commitment of national funds to support peace processes and having greater transparency in national public finances, which then can encourage greater partner support, because it's clear where the national resources can take the process and where additional support is required in order to let it move on to the next stage.
I fully agree with Hannah, and I can sort of catch up here. I think also the peace agreements I have seen is that the provisions very often are kind of, some are super specific, some are more generic, but they usually need renegotiation. And the renegotiation is the point, I think also, Hannah, where you come in, and this is not a project. This is not a donor project. This is a national societal project where usually not all the provisions of an agreement have priority. So what we need to do is to really see what are those provisions that have priority at a certain stage because of the public support and the elite support and the civil society support, and giving those priority and really seeing as a constant renegotiation in order to get to what Teresa mentioned, really this pathway to an inclusive society, rather than just tick boxing the implementation of the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Emily, in 15 seconds, 20 seconds, is there anything else that you'd like to say to the expert panel?
Yes, thank you very, very much for bringing that out. Indeed, funding of processes should not be made an obligation of international partners. And that's why somewhere in my pitch, when I talked of the steps to address, I mentioned that we need to ensure that the implementation of this transitional agreement with the detailed strategy that I talked about and matching implementation costs is preceded. Before we start that transition, there has to be an obligation pledges agreement. And this has to include everybody who is involved in the negotiation. In our case, you have the mediator, you have the guarantors, you have witnesses, we have then the stakeholders and then the parties. In this kind of agreement, after we have a whole unpacked agreement, it's time now to say, this is what we are going to commit. As a government, this is what is going to be committed at the government of the country. The women will say, the civil society will say, this is what we are going to do. And the international partners can then come in and express their priorities clearly on what they will be able to fund and what they will not be able to. And that is understood from the beginning, so that there is no back and forth during the transition about who is to fund what and who is not to fund what. I think that's what I can say now. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Emily, and I'm conscious of time, so we're going to turn now to our next peace builder. We will be joined by Betty Bigombe again. And Betty, if you turn on your, there we go, excellent. Again, let's welcome back Betty. I'm going to start off in the same order, so I'll ask Teresa to provide her reflections.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Betty, for your proposal. This one I would really rather just bat straight to Hannah, given the African specificity of it and the high politics involved. But I'll just say a couple of points on the challenges of appointments. A critical problem, and in a way sad that we're talking about this in terms of innovation when it shouldn't be innovation, of trying to match the best mediator to the best to process, and also establish professional mediation teams. But the issue of appointments within the continent, but beyond the continent as well, speaking from the UN perspective, is a very, very tricky one, and we see there's a kind of tangle of processes where we've had within UN a big effort to professionalize recruitment processes, even at a high level. Also some very good efforts, the Secretary General's gender parity strategy and the senior women talent pipeline, some very good efforts to get a lot more senior women into the system, and very good at the moment, like in the DPPA field missions, we have more than 50% women in SRSG and deputy SRSG positions. And some beginning to see some women mediators, and you look at what Stephanie Williams has been doing and is doing at the moment in Libya, really encouraging. But at the same time, the appointment process, as Bessie alludes to, everywhere is a mixture of politics and professional criteria, and that's what we would live with. I would say, and touching on something that Betty mentioned as well, that in all circumstances, it's really important to think kind of holistically about the team, so that if there is a big man brought in as their former president, and it's not just his usual aides, but thinking about ways to establish a professional mediation team with people in there who know and are thinking forward about questions of inclusion and questions of involvement of women, and that there are things to be done in different circumstances. I'll stop there.
Anna?
Thank you very much, Teresa. Betty, the question I have for you is, most of these mediation processes take place under the auspices of our regional or sub-regional organizations, which means under the African Union or any of the RECs, IGAD, ECOWAS, etc., etc. So what would you say about how, rather, when there is the appointment of a political heavyweight as the chief mediator, rather to ensure that the capacity for the mediation support is built into our regional and sub-regional organizations so that it is a standing professional capacity that can be deployed at short notice to support a mediation process. Because I don't think we have to think about reinventing the wheel all the time. And I think that expertise is developed with practice. And so to the extent that it is possible within the institutional frameworks that exist on the continent to be able to develop that supporting capacity, then maybe that might be another way of dealing with what you have suggested as an innovative solution. And I agree with Teresa, it shouldn't be innovative. The other challenge that I see with your proposal is that I agree with you that it is not all big men, quote unquote, who have the capacity or the knowledge to be able to mediate. But sometimes with the political actors involved in track one mediation processes, if there isn't somebody appointed as the chief mediator who they feel a certain sense of difference towards, it's very difficult to push them into making the compromises that are required to have an agreement. And no agreement is perfect. We could always think about what we could do better, what we could do differently. But ultimately, you want to have some set of points on which you can build further and then develop and strengthen peace processes. So those are my two issues. I agree with you that not all people have the capacity to be able, not all heads of state, former senior officials have the capacity to mediate. But how would you fill that gap of ensuring that the person has the clout to move the process along? And two, do you think that building capacity with sub-regional organizations might be the way of professionalizing the mediation support?
Tanya.
Yeah, Betty, it's a tough one. Yeah, because it's very political. And I think that's why it's probably easier for me to say something than for the ones who are in official positions. But I mean, I feel for you and with you. And that's what I really like with you, that you're just speaking it out. So I think, but I also agree, of course, with Teresa and with Hannah, the tough sort of way of implementing is like, what can you do more than doing the professionals here and this and this? So my question to you is rather like an idea that came to my mind while listening to you and listening to Teresa and Hannah, is that the processes I have been seeing in Africa that I found really interesting, like, for example, the Kofi Annan mediation in Kenya, 2008, in terms of setting a panel, of, in that case, it was Grassa Machel and Kofi Annan, and having a support structure around that was not, on the one hand, the usual technical support structure, but there was a lot of political support. And of course, Kofi Annan was like, I would say, he was a master of juggling around the networks. So in the sense what Hannah said, how do you get the clouds and the networks? Because what I often see is that the international contract groups or the regional contract groups, if they played well, it was a team of kind of small group of people that understood this is needed and we need to be in very close exchange. Sometimes there are also some others from civil society, but it's like a small club of people who understand this is urgent, we need to push this forward, we understand what's going on. So what I see is if you have that constellation, and especially if you have it with people who really can park their egos and think, what can we do for the process? Yeah, and not like how can I come out of this process best? I think this is a thing. So my question to you is also, how do you get those other networks in? And at the same time, how do you think putting out kind of criteria, formal criteria, will solve the problem? Is that really enough? That's my question to you.
Yeah, that's great, Tanya. Thank you. That was where my head was going as well, is how do you, we know what works in terms of that political clout, but how do you get that to be regularized, and is formal criteria really the way to get there? Betty, I look forward to your response.
Thank you very much for the comments, questions, and observation. I'll go straight to what to Teresa's observation. One thing is, I would like to make it clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong by appointing somebody from the region. Just like I would say there's nothing wrong with appointing somebody with political clout, because it helps to open doors. if you have a non-entity looking to see a head of state, probably that door will not be opened. But what I would like to emphasize is that former president, is he capable to deliver? Does he have what it takes to be a mediator? Because here we are looking for an agreement which is sustainable, which is implementable. And consequently, if you have somebody with political clout who will come in and shove down the throat of the parties of this is what you must do. We all know what is right, but is this something that appeals to the parties, that they'll be happy to implement, that they eventually will shake hands and say, this is an agreement that belongs to us, we formulated it, and we agree with everything that has been put on paper, and will be committed to implement. So but what I'm emphasizing is, can we come up with a criteria that if it's going to be former President B, Benson, does he have what it takes? Is he a good listener? Is he patient? Does he know the context well? Is he going to take time to deal with it? It makes me almost jump in to what Tanya was raising. Is that, yeah, is criteria enough? But we might even have all the technocrats to support the chief mediator. But if you have, which I have seen in some regional leaders, who will bulldoze things their way and not necessarily listen to the technocrats' advice, then we're not going to arrive at an agreement which can deliver peace, sustainable peace, which is inclusive. I have seen also those chief mediators from the region, when you talk about inclusivity, yes, they will say yes, they will not say no. But when it comes to actual implementation, to ensure that there's proper inclusivity, then they're not there. The excuses being given are always very flimsy. So what I am trying to say in here is that I'm not opposed to that. It's political, but professionalism is required, but it's also the personality of the person matters in all this. I totally agree with you, Hannah, that we cannot reinvent the wheel, but let's be innovative and smart and look for ways that can deliver on sustainable peace. Yeah, Tanya, I partially answered your question. Let me see. Yeah, yeah, and that is what takes me to the question of that. Is it possible to get leaders, former leaders, so to speak, that have political clout, that can accept some element of induction, that they need to know certain basic requirements in mediation, including inclusivity? Because when you start mediation, I'm sure all of you know this, on a wrong footing, when things are not everything agreed upon is not in place, then it's very difficult to come back and correct the process. So it is extremely important that we have a criteria for the selection. We can guide the leaders who have to make the decision of who should be the mediators. We can, so that they know what is important in mediation. Not all of them know it. And so that it's the personality who will follow have some guidelines, who will accept some kind of training so that they can conduct the process in a manner that can realize sustainable peace. I think basically this is what I wanted to say, that yes, we can have training, we can have criteria, but we also need to look into the personalities of the people that will be selected. And I'm not against picking on the regional leaders. It's important because they might know the context better, they might know the situation and culture better, but they must have certain personalities, they need to have some kind of training so that they conduct the process successfully in a manner that can be implemented successfully. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. We are indeed running a little bit short on time, so we're going to go straight to our next peace builder. Yasmin, if you can turn on your video. And so again, because we are constrained for time at this point, I think we'll stick to that model of the initial reflections and then a response from Yasmin. So Teresa, you're up.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Yasmin. Thank you particularly for bringing in the youth, peace and security agenda at this critical point. I think while we're all thinking about the inclusion of women, as we look forward and again to that broader vision of an inclusive society, it's absolutely critical that we think about youth. I always think back to the process beginning in Afghanistan, and if you look at Afghanistan, half the population is under 25, they've grown up under war. We need to find a process that answers to their dreams and their hopes for the future of Afghanistan. Not a lot of deals amongst the people who've just been fighting that war is absolutely critical. Beyond that, I had a couple of questions about the specifics of the proposal, which I think needing to find ways to harness youth and bring them in closer to the peace process is absolutely essential. I wasn't convinced by the focus on Europeans, delegations and EU envoys and stuff. We need to be thinking about the process itself. I think I found the word conference a bit confusing, and perhaps it was tied to the Palermo conference rather than kind of more normal conferences, because for me the issue is what are the kind of structures and support to get the voices and perspectives of youth and the intersectionality of youth, different youth, men, women from different parts of the country with different experiences, different ethnic, religious backgrounds, getting all of that in, but into the process itself rather than into necessarily, first of all, the ears of the EU envoys. And similarly, a sort of flag of needing to think quite carefully about the balance between diaspora and in a national youth of the people who are there, and making sure that it's anchored in the country and anchored forward for the future. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. To add to the point that Teresa has made about inclusivity and bringing the youth on board, I think the additional question that I'd like you to address is, it's not just a question of quotas, and it's not just a question of having participation, but what exactly do you think that would be required in order for those who are selected, if on the basis of quotas, to have the legitimacy that demonstrates that they have a constituency? Because I think that it's not just about numbers, it's also about making sure that there is some fallback, there is some continuous ongoing dialogue with people who are interested in this process, and making sure that that inclusivity is part of the reason why such representatives demonstrate their value in these processes. These days, I'm hearing a lot about co-leadership, intersectionality, and making sure that there's, an equal balance between the young and the old. And I think that in principle, that's fine. But I would like us to also look at the issue of what exactly, how do we determine who you represent as youth? And in any society, there's always the people who are directly affected, who are in the conflict situation, and then there's a diaspora who certainly influence the process. But it's also important that there should be some consensus building between these various groups before you come to the table. Otherwise, you are likely not to be playing a constructive role in a mediation process. And then what I would also like to add is that indeed, it's not Europe alone that is involved in peace processes or developing peace processes. And so we need to look at the wide variety of actors who can be involved in a peace process and who will bring value to that process. So let's not, just think about it in terms of who might be the funding partners, but who can actually bring a different set of skills to the table or a different set of influences to the table that will all contribute to a harmonious process. So thank you. Those are my comments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Yasmin, and thank you, Hannah and Teresa. I think we all agree the youth needs to be part, that's for sure, because in most countries, the youth is just overwhelming amount of people. And I was very touched personally. I remember when I was involved in the 2001 Afghanistan peace process in Bonn, it was so stuck. It was so stuck. And then there was actually a diaspora youth activist who was in the parallel consultative forum and stood up and says, "You are ruining our future." And that really changed the dynamics. And she talked to the mediators, to the parties after that. That really changed it because the perspective changed on the future. So I think that's a given. But then, of course, I agree with Teresa and Hannah. How do you make that happen? And of course, I also agree on that it's not the EU alone, but I can understand where you come from in your thinking. My best model, actually, I have ever seen in comparative peace processes is the Yemeni National Dialogue. I think they worked out a really nice formula where you have, which answers also Hannah's question on which youth and constituencies. So there was a quota for women, for youth, and for the geographical marginalized region of the South that was in the delegations. Means the politicians decide, we have a quota, so and so many of us have to be young. So the constituency is clear, it's the party. Then they had, in addition, to do justice sort of to broader constituencies, they had a youth, a women, and a southern separate delegation, which was clearly comprised out of activists. So I think that's a very interesting model. And the question is, how do we get to this model and how do parties accept sort of the youth representation? Here comes your coercion point of view, which is of course a dream world scenario. And it's also a little bit of a colonial scenario. So here come the big guys from outside and say, you have to, otherwise we don't fund. So, so I think I'm with you because I'm often dreaming about it. Why can not member states just implement and put pressure on what they have all agreed politically? So in the one hand, the condition scenario is a dream scenario. It should just be a normal, not a condition. On the other hand, it comes along very imperialistic. So the question is, how do societies kind of put pressure? And the best processes I have seen look at some of the reform processes, which are not the classical track one processes in Lebanon today, in Belarus, where youth or in Sudan is massively on the street and just puts pressure. So the idea of, I think, and that relates back to what Sarah said in the beginning, and I think somebody else said it in terms of being invited or claiming spaces. It's about how also claiming spaces and making your voice heard and becoming legitimate through claiming spaces is a different thing than just sitting there and being invited by some donors who think you should be there. That's my reaction. Thank you.
That was Her Royal Highness who brought that up in her statement that I echoed. But Yasmin, I'm really interested, I know we're short on time, so if you can keep your reflections short, but part of our discussion was your frustration with that sort of imperialist seeming approach of these conferences. So I'm interested in your response to Tanya's and Teresa and Hannah's points.
Definitely, thank you so much. For a sake of time, I wasn't able to explain how critical I am on those approaches, but because they exist and because I feel I have a responsibility coming from a certain region to also call out these practices, but trying to change them from within. And as an appointed expert for the African Union and the European Union, we have been reflecting on what youth from both continents can do together. And for example, I can just mention on donors, the expertise of my colleagues from Nigeria has changed completely how 10 million euros allocated by the European Union have been, put on certain regions in Nigeria and Niger and Cameroon, Lake Chad Basin region. So I can just say that, of course, having this approach is super important. Involving actors not only from the European side is also essential. And by the way, this is why I spoke about also external actors. But of course, when we have this process being initiated by European donors, I would like to see a more intersectional approach. And of course, quota are not enough. I agree with you. Thank you so much for your points. Very valuable. And I believe that creating advisory capacity roles from youth in both, conflict affecting countries and diaspora is essential. And this, I think, would be the main point I would like to foster, because listening to them is not enough if you don't give them a meaningful role. And yeah, I will just stop here for sake of time. Thank you so much for your
so much, Jasmine. Okay, we have our final peace builder with her reflections. Daniela, if you can turn on your screen and unmute. I'm hoping that we have our interpretation working better as well. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, Teresa, I will turn to you for your reflections.
Hola, Daniela. Thank you so much for this proposal. I really liked it for a number of reasons, and I think it also has a potential for us to think forward in innovative terms about how to facilitate this kind of territorial dialogue in the future. And I'm not just thinking it's very rooted in Colombia, but I'm thinking also of the validity of it for other contexts, obviously. A couple of things that I think in the discussion about inclusion, if we don't watch it, we can get stuck, not us who think about these things a lot, but the discussion can get stuck at thinking about we must include women or we must include women and youth, and that's good. And we can lose the critical importance of including diverse geographic and diverse populations in diverse, complicated countries, and needing to bring that in is really critical. And so thinking about dialogue tables which do that in intersectionality again, but in across a range of diversity, geographic, ethnic, sexual and other, gender identity, all of these things is really good. I think the other there are questions about sustainability, how to keep it context, how to keep it continuous as you're proposing, but also an area for thinking. In your proposal, your pitch opens the door to it, is how we can all be thinking about maximizing digital tools for inclusion. And it's something that is beginning to happen more. We've seen it from the UN side on Yemen and Libya. We're working really closely with the Libyan mission at the moment about how to push outwards. So I see a kind of a realm of possibilities moving forward to do more of this kind of thing, and needing to think about how probably to mix. So you kind of have dialogue processes that mix real people and real exchange, as we know from all of our experience of COVID, how much we miss real life and real life engagement and dialogue with people, but also maximizing what we've also had to learn very quickly about what you can do with digital tools. So I'll stop there given the constraints of time, but thank you.
Hannah.
So thank you very much. I found your contribution very interesting, especially with regard to the use of digital tools. I must say that even though we've been using digital tools for so many things, I've always had my, if you like, reservations about just how effective they can be in in the processes of implementation of peace agreements. But I do think that the point you made about extraterritorial dialogues, and therefore, as I understand it, breaking down the implementation processes and having different ongoing processes simultaneously that focus on implementation with a group of willing and engaged participants could possibly be a way of ensuring that this implementation process is carried forward. The only caution that I would add to that is that, it's important for us to bear in mind that peace processes are not an end in themselves, they are a means to an end. And so therefore, as we use digital tools to have these kind of dialogues, they should be focused, and I think the point that Emily made earlier in her pitch is useful in this regard. They should be focused on achieving particular outcomes with as much consultation and inclusivity as possible, as you have suggested, with quotas taking into account a large variety of actors, so that we can move from peace implementation to the next stage of nation building. Because we can't just leave it at we can't just focus on the peace process itself without looking at to what happens next. But I think that of the 3 pitches, I think yours was the 4 pitches, I beg your pardon. I think yours was the one that I enjoyed the most, even though we had translation issues.
Thank you, Anna. Tanya.
Yes, I follow up in line. I really like, hola Daniela, I really like your proposal. Of course, as I think we heard, it's very grounded in the Colombian experience, because historically in Colombia, you had all these dialogue tables. And I remember, I guess you were also part of the indigenous table, even before the peace process. I remember at one stage, there was an assessment done by the Colombian government that there were 150 dialogue tables out there in Colombia without the ones installed by the peace process. So this is, so on the one hand, it's a really good proposal, and I'm totally with it. On the other hand, the experience of Colombia also has shown that sometimes there's a lot of dialogue for the sake of dialogue and to pacify constituencies, yeah, to use it almost as an instrument of power and control in order to say, okay, here you can discuss, so shut up. So the question is, how can this instrument that in my view is really innovative and should be used in other contexts, both sort of the digital inclusion and the regional, the focus on the regional, that goes away from this, I would say, just some women here, some youth here, but really say, what's the heart of the problem in this region and how does it contribute to the national level peace process? How can this be made effective and not just cosmetic? Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Daniela, your responses.
Vale, pues yo creo que primero agradecerles frente al tema de...
First of all, I would like to thank you for your comments.
Lo he planteado en términos de manera presencial y de manera virtual.
I have seen this both in person and virtually. From the interpreter, the audio is fading. We should be able to guarantee the inclusion of indigenous populations, not only territorial-wise, but they should be able to not only be included as inclusion per se, but they should have a voice in the process. And once we reach the implementation phase, they will also have a voice. Reach agreements that are being proposed, and eventually will help us, once the agreements are established, that we can go out and speak and teach the population as to what all of this encompasses. And we would also create territorial leaders, make them active, not only from the territorial point of view, but provide them with the ability to listen and to participate with the community and bring the community's points of view to the table. In terms of dialogue, a lot of it also has to do with the will of the communities. We have many agreements in Colombia. There are many things that communities have included in these peace or these agreements, but oftentimes these agreements are not implemented, and you end up with an increase in violence, as we are seeing now in Colombia. The increase of the armed actors, of armed groups, is something that has to be taken into account, and my proposal includes bringing them to the table and including them as well. We would have the armed groups, the non and the unarmed groups. We need for them to be actors to sign the peace agreements, not only the communities. That way, we would get divergent points of views, and I think that would mitigate the violence and the resurgence of violence if they are included in this process. So we would put the onus on the regional governments to make that happen and bring these proposals to fruition. I don't think I caught Tanya's question. If perhaps you could repeat it.
I think my question was that how do you ensure that there is not just dialogue for the sake of dialogue and pacify sort of people's voices almost, and make sure that they really can be effectively influencing sort of the different levels of politics?
Listo. Digamos que se puede reflejar el impacto a través de
You can
que
look at the impact, as you indicated. These would be territorial roundtables. They would present the proposals, and they would bring the people to the tables. They would do the follow-up. The important thing is that the roundtables bring a final proposal to fruition, but that it should include community and all of the different groups in the territories, in the regions, so that every group can present their ideas, have them included. And it would also thus guarantee that these agreements would reach fruition. And then we could disseminate through these groups all that information to the territory and to all the different groups in the region. And that is why I think that these tables, these round tables, are so important and why we should increase them.
Muchísimas gracias, Daniela.
Thank you, Daniela.
We are, of course, very over time because this has been a really rich discussion. We're going to change the program just slightly so that we can have our high-level panel quasi on time. So for our audience, you will see at this moment that the link is up for you to provide your feedback on these innovative pitches. Please do head there now and
vayan ahí ahora.
And take a look at the questions. You'll have sort of another 20-25 minutes to fill out that form as before the end of the discussion, before the end of the event, which is when I will present those results. So for now, we're going to take a literally 2-minute break, just to allow you as the audience a chance to look at that voting. We will come back in 2 minutes for our high-level segment. So I just would like to thank again the Peace Builders and our absolutely fantastic expert panel for your wonderful reflections and this discussion. Thank you so much. All right, now this is the second most important vote that some of you will be making over the next week. So please go vote both times.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. I hope that you are all, as the audience, availing yourself of this innovative voting form and process that we have ongoing through the end of the event. But now I am absolutely delighted to turn to our high-level panelists, high-level on this discussion, our high-level panelists for their reflections as partners to give us their global perspectives on some of the issues we've been discussing today. So I am more than delighted to turn first to our colleague from the United Nations, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenka, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs. ASG, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Excellencies, colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank the governments of Kenya, Mexico, Norway, and the United Kingdom, as well as Inclusive Peace, for organizing this event. It has been an important opportunity to highlight the need for new and innovative approaches for more inclusive peacemaking. I have been following the discussion since the very beginning, and I have to say that it has been extremely interesting, very inspirational, and I am happy to see, such enthusiastic peace builders on the screen and working, let's say, in the field as well. This is where those peace processes, where the preventive diplomacy is being done. Recent data clearly demonstrates why we need these approaches. Between 1992 and 2019, women constituted on average only 13% of negotiators and only 6% of mediators and signatories to major peace processes around the world. Even as UN mediators and envoys reach gender parity, 55% of heads and deputy heads of special political missions are women. And I am very happy to see among us today Hannah Tete, who is one of them. The UN regional organizations, member states, as well as conflict parties alike need to do better. Let me now outline some of the ways in which the United Nations is trying to address the vast underrepresentation of women in peace processes and highlight some of the other persistent gaps in the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. First, partnerships with local level women activists, civil society organizations, women's networks, women leaders, and their transformative work are absolutely crucial. We must support women actors to participate in peace processes and facilitate the often missing linkages between local level efforts and official track 1 processes. Several of you mentioned that it is not enough just to have a certain number of women, but have at the table really women who understand the situation on the ground and who can contribute first-hand experience, knowledge to those processes. I have several examples that I could share. Teresa, my colleague, already did mention some of them, but since we are running late, so if you allow me, I will go directly to my second point. In this time of increasingly complex conflicts and pushback against inclusion of and women's rights, we need context-specific strategies. To this end, we are holding high-level strategy meetings to develop context-specific approaches for women's participation in UN-supported peace processes. The first such strategy meeting on Yemen took place in April, organized together with the Secretary General Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. Preparations are now underway in a number of other contexts. In Central Asia, for example, UN Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy has embarked on an initiative to promote the role of women in regional processes on peace and security by launching a Women Leaders Caucus, which consists of women leaders from the 5 countries in the region. Third, adequate and sustainable funding is a precondition for effective implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. During 2019, 40% of the United Nations Peacebuilding Fund investments amounting to $76 million supported gender-responsive peacebuilding through UN entities and civil society organizations.
You've just muted yourself, ASG, I think.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
So during 2019,
Durante el año 2019, un cuarto del el 25%
dollars supported gender-responsive peacebuilding through UN entities and civil society organizations. In the face of the pandemic, the fund has allowed programmatic flexibility to shift focus towards preventing and addressing gender-based violence. Ensuring a safe space and security is only a first step, but an absolute prerequisite for the political engagement of women. In Guinea-Bissau, for example, the fund helped strengthen the capacity of the Bissau-Guinean Women's Council as part of its support to political dialogue and national reconciliation. In early 2019, civil society groups supported by the Peacebuilding Fund encouraged the main political parties to sign the Stability Pact, committing not only to respect the results of the ballot box, but also to work together for a stable government in the long term. Within the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, we have committed a minimum of 17% of our extra budgetary funds for the promotion of gender equality and to help advance the critical role of women in conflict prevention and peacemaking. We have also strengthened the requirements for gender-sensitive budgeting and adopted a gender marker tool to ensure more consistent integration of the women, peace and security agenda in our project management. I encourage donor countries to adopt similar measures, including for bilateral aid, to address the chronic underfunding of programming related to women, peace and security. Finally, we must invest in innovation and digital technologies. Our policy and mediation division that is led by Teresa, who is today with us, is currently exploring the use of artificial intelligence for mediators and other actors to hold real-time consultations with a large group of individuals in local dialects and languages. In June, together with the Office of Special Envoy for Yemen, we conducted a large-scale virtual consultation with Yemeni citizens on the opportunities and challenges of the ongoing peace process. During the live interactive online dialogue, more than 500 Yemeni participants, a third of them women, expressed their thoughts on the future of the peace process. Similar dialogue was conducted also with a Libyan youth leader this month. Finally, this summer, we piloted a course on digital inclusion that identified entry points for the use of digital technology to enhance the inclusion of women in mediation processes. We are currently reviewing proposals to address specific inclusion challenges and will be assessing opportunities for building on this pilot moving forward. Of course, myself as a diplomat and having worked in the field for the United Nations as well, I cannot stop here and make one small comment. And this small comment is about, we cannot replace direct meetings, face to face, in order to really feel the situation, the atmosphere, the temperature. So digital technology cannot replace this old traditional approach, but at the same time, in the times of pandemic, like for example now, we need to combine as much as we can those approaches. Colleagues, friends, I understand the time is up, so I would like just to conclude. The discussions here today reiterate the need for creative ways to tackle the persistent barriers to women's full and equal participation in peace and political processes. At the UN, we are fully committed to continuing this work together with member states, with civil society partners, with you, in order to achieve sustainable and just peace for all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I know the rest of our panelists all have significant time constraints, so I will ask you, with apologies, to keep your remarks as brief as possible. I would now like to welcome one of our partners on this event, Minister James Cleverley, the Minister of State for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined today, particularly the women peace builders for their innovative pitches. I also welcome the global efforts to mark the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, highlighting both progress and the need to do more to drive tangible change. Resolution 1325 recognized that for peace to be sustainable, the peace process must be inclusive. The cruel irony is that while they are routinely excluded from the peace process, when women are included, they make a massive difference. Women have played instrumental roles in diffusing conflict and promoting stability throughout history. Their collaborative approaches to peace building transcends cultural and sectorial divides. They bring experience and knowledge often overlooked and yet critical factors in sustainable peace. Women bring an alternative view to the negotiating table by balancing various interests of different communities, whilst also addressing the needs of victims and survivors. This balance is instrumental to sustainable peace. So, for example, in 1996 in Guatemala, women established a civil society forum to raise cultural issues and push for long-standing peace-building measures. In 1998, Northern Irish women formed their own political party to participate in the peace process. In Liberia in 2003, women organized a grassroots movement demanding an end to war and mediating between governments and rebel leaders. And in 2014, in the Philippines, women made sure that the whole community was involved in the peace process by representing diverse views and facilitating understanding. Unfortunately, these examples are the exceptions rather than the rule. And despite strong evidence that women's participation in peace negotiations increases durability and quality of peace, rhetoric still does not match reality. Women continue to be underrepresented in decision-making processes, sidelined in peace-building efforts, and confined to either traditional or perhaps worse still, tokenistic roles. And what is the end result? Peace processes stall and civilians suffer the consequences. Take Bosnia. 20 years after the peace agreement was agreed, with no female participation, the country still struggles with insecurity, instability, and inertia. Or Yemen, where despite sustained efforts by women to increase their participation, they continue to be excluded and conflict persists. It is clear contemporary methods of negotiating peace processes are not working as effectively as they should. Sustainable peace cannot simply be imposed by elite will. The very communities affected by the conflict must own the solutions to them. To do that, they must have a central role. Inclusivity is a means, a process, and an end. And women are the key. That's why the UK is using the 20th anniversary to strengthen our support for women working to build peace on the ground and to validate their efforts. The UK supports the women mediators across the Commonwealth initiative in their collective advocacy for women's meaningful participation. Mediator networks are vital to connect women, offer peer-to-peer learning, and to support the development of lasting solutions by mediating between policymakers and local people. We are backing the Global Alliance of Women Mediators to drive implementation of Resolution 1325 and consistently create space for women to participate in, influence, and ultimately lead peace processes. We urge multilateral organizations to be transparent in deployment, appointments, and give women fair opportunity to participate in peace building efforts. Women must be safe from reprisals if they are to meaningfully participate. And the UK is pleased to have supported the ICANN protection framework for women peace builders and hopes others will endorse this, its critical recommendations. We are also leveraging the full force of our overseas network to facilitate and enable the work of women peace builders to create safe environments for them to operate. Our embassies are engaged with women working on the grassroots to understand the challenges they face and how the UK government can best support and amplify their work, building on their legitimacy in the international community. To achieve truly inclusive peace processes, we must all make changes. How we plan for peace, who formulates them, and which voices are heard in the process. It must become unthinkable to not have women intrinsically involved in every stage of the peace process. The pitches we heard today demonstrate how innovative thinking can initiate change to secure inclusive, sustainable peace. As champion of women's participation, Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, "Real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time." Today, we take another critical step. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. We greatly appreciate your comments and reflections and the partnership of the United Kingdom on this event and on women, peace, and security. So I know you might need to leave us, so I just wanted to say thank you for that. I'm very grateful that we still have our minister from Mexico, who will give her remarks at this point. Martha Delgado, Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, Ministers Cleverley, Umamo, and Halverson, and hello also to Mr. Jenka. Good morning from Mexico City. It is a pleasure for me being here in representation of a Mexican Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Ebrard. Allow me first to thank the governments of the United Kingdom, Kenya, and also Norway, as well as our partners from civil society, in particular Inclusive Peace, for joining efforts with Mexico to organize this important event. It has been 20 years since the adoption of Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And this milestone resolution highlighted the disproportionate impact of armed conflict on women and girls, as well as the relevance of women leadership and participation in the reconstruction of societies conflict resolution and sustaining peace. So the innovative event which brings us together today has given the opportunity to hear the voices and be inspired by the wonderful work of women peace builders who have shared with us concrete ideas on how they would design inclusive peace processes and accelerate progress on the ground. We need to strengthen our partnership to support their efforts. Next year, Mexico and France will, along with the UN Women and civil society organizations, will convene the Generation Equality Forum. In the framework of the forum, we welcome the inclusion of a compact women, peace and security and humanitarian action, which will be crucial to integrate intergenerational approach to tackle discriminatory barriers that prevents women's equal participation in international peace and security and human efforts. And also to promote the work of women peace builders and women human rights defenders, as well as ensure women leadership in all peace and security and humanitarian decision-making processes. There can be important synergies between the compact and the ideas and proposals made today in order to accomplish meaningful progress of the WPS agenda. So as you may know, Mexico is also committed to fulfilling its feminist foreign policy for the first of its kind in Latin America, which is based on a set of principles that seeks to promote government actions to reduce gender gaps and inequalities and to contribute to build a more just and prosperous society. So moreover, Mexico will actively promote gender equality during its non-permanent membership in the Security Council during the 2021-2022 period. Likewise, we will encourage a greater coordination between the existing formal and informal mechanisms to promote WPS agenda. So we are implementing a women peace building program to ensure women's participation in politics aimed at the creation of a safe and violent-free environment at the national and local levels. And we are very, very glad to share this year we will present the first national action plan on women, peace and security for Mexico. Distinguished colleagues, the only way to recover from the effects of the current pandemic is with renewed commitment, not to leave anyone behind, and also with gender-based approach in which the leadership of women and youth builders is a reality and not just an aspiration. Thank you very much for inviting us, and I look forward to continue working together.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your partnership on this event and also the work that Mexico is doing, as you say, through the feminist foreign policy. Thank you very much for your time. I am delighted to turn now to our partner in Kenya, Ambassador Rachel Omamo, the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs in Kenya. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Kenya is honored to co-host this event alongside the United Kingdom, Mexico, and Norway at a time when the world is celebrating the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. Kenya's forthcoming term in the United Nations Security Council will draw attention to and emanate appropriate global action on the subject of women, peace, and security. As we seek the full and equal participation of women in peacekeeping, let us acknowledge the tenacity of women peace builders in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has not only exposed the depth of global inequality, but it has also affirmed the truism that none of us is at peace really, or completely shielded from conflict. Additionally, the pandemic has exposed the burden women bear in ensuring the health of our societies, as well as in fostering peace and security. Although we have made certain strides in our quest to include women in peace processes, more needs to be done to make the full implementation of UN Security Council 1325 a reality. Today's pictures highlight the complex issue of inclusivity. I congratulate all the participants for their powerful ideas. I submit that a new architecture for inclusive peace must reflect the convoluted, dynamic, and often asymmetrical nature of today's conflicts. Women's inclusion entails innovative interventions because inclusivity is not a fixed concept in the context of our complicated conflicts. Indeed, inclusion for some invariably amounts to exclusion for others. An inclusive peace is a deliberate cause, sustained by purposeful policies and strategies that prioritize women's rights and reveal the transformational value of their contributions to peace. Further, inclusion needs to be context specific, and so requires us to avoid neat categorizations, templating, and the standardization of processes to which peace relate. Ladies and gentlemen, for Kenya, the implementation of UN Security Council 1325 requires concerted and consistent action from both the government and its citizens. Dissonance in the appreciation and appropriation of the women, peace, and security nexus impedes the implementation of the resolution. Thus, we must address the deeply entrenched social cultural stereotypes about women that constrain their full participation in our societies. We must weave gender-sensitive initiatives into the design of peace-building processes to obviate the suppression of women's needs and aspirations in the conflict cycle. Women's inclusion rarely occurs organically, especially within the conflict zones where political and economic issues between male-dominated warring factions often blur the picture. Inclusion must therefore be pursued through concerted action, deliberate action, and novel strategies, particularly from the guarantors and founders of peace and funders of peace processes, such as UN agencies, international organizations, NGOs, friendly countries, working in concert with women on the ground. Unless these organizations work with women, women will not own the process and women will not achieve the inclusive peace that we desire. The Kenyan government has developed a national action plan to catalyze the mainstreaming of UN Resolution 1325 into development, diplomacy, conflict prevention and resolution, peace and security, and reconciliation strategies. Kenya succeeded in training women peace builders at grassroots level and then incorporating them into government-supported peace and reconciliation committees. Also, our security organs, particularly the Kenya Defense Forces, have developed gender policies and strategies that advance the career progression of women to decision-making roles. Further, our defense forces have increased the number of women engaged in peacekeeping missions, so that now approximately 19% of Kenya's peacekeepers deployed in the field are women. Similarly, Kenya has made gender-based training an integral part of the curriculum of our defense and security forces. We believe that retuning the mindset of the security sector allows for the inclusion of women in conflict resolution and peace building, especially in decision-making positions. Ladies and gentlemen, we also wish to state that we support an intergenerational approach that links women, peace and security and youth, peace and security. These agendas must be aligned for a comprehensive and holistic response that leaves no one behind. In the same vein, our experiences in confronting radicalization and violent extremism have taught us that inclusion must also be community-based. In addition, issues regarding climate change and sustainable development should be interlaced into our peace-building conversations and strategies, as these factors aggravate marginalization, dislocate and weaken communities, and exacerbate gender inequality, thereby operating as threat multipliers and bottlenecks to inclusive peace. Lastly, we believe in nurturing regional context-based and context-informed peace-building policies and projects, such as the work of the African Union's FemWise Africa and the AU Continental Results Framework for monitoring and reporting on the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Kenya has validated the CFR in March 2018. It is important that inclusion be measured quantitatively and qualitatively. We need to see progress, we need to measure it, we need to hold ourselves accountable. With these remarks, I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you so much for those comments. And I just really want to highlight the issues around this takes concerted action, that these sort of institutional biases will not end themselves. So I will now turn to our final speaker of the event from Norway. I would very much like to welcome State Secretary Alden Halverson of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This 20th anniversary provides us with an opportunity to reflect upon our approach to peace processes and how to make them more inclusive. I think we have heard some very interesting and innovative ideas and perspectives here today. Based on Norway's experience in facilitation and mediation processes, I would like to highlight some of the elements that we consider essential for success. And the first is really gender parity around the table, with the women and men both be present and playing real substantive roles in high-level negotiations, in the working groups, and in all the relevant processes. Second, we see a need for close links between track 1 and track 2 processes. Third, delegation leaders and facilitators must take an inclusive approach, addressing any shortcomings in representation and perspectives. And finally, peace processes should create frameworks for strengthening inclusion and women's rights in the development of new institutional structures as part of longer-term solutions. The 1325 agenda is now very well established. WPS resolutions have been adopted by consensus, and 86 countries have developed their action plans. And I welcome the message from our Mexican colleagues on their action plan. However, despite the broad cross-regional support for this global normative framework, much work is still needed. I think we all know that. Among the challenges we are facing, women's underrepresentation in track 1 processes, as several of the speakers have touched upon, is perhaps the most pressing. And correcting this must really be a key priority. While at the same time, peacemaking is rarely a binary process between two parties, nor are peace processes linear, and they often require engagement on a range of levels. And addressing these challenges requires insight and flexibility, and we know that women must be involved across the board. To ensure gender balance in track 1 processes, we must make use of all our resources and tools. And the good news is that the experts are there. Norway has provided substantial support for the Nordic Women Mediators Network and played an active role in establishing the Global Alliance of Regional Women Mediator Networks. And it is clear that there is a substantial group of qualified women who are ready to take on key roles in track 1, and we should encourage that and maintain a momentum in bringing that to happen. And in peace processes in which Norway is engaged, we attach importance to ensuring that women can play a meaningful role and are included in all delegations. And many of our special envoys are now women, and we also encourage others to include women in their delegations. We provide funding for high-level gender courses for mediators, and we aim for gender balance in training activities, for instance, at the Oslo Forum and the annual UN ceasefire mediation course here in Oslo. And these activities are intended to ensure that mediators who are deployed, whether they are men or women, are equipped with the tools they need to promote gender-sensitive processes. And in order to make participation in Track 1 processes more inclusive, it is vital to establish strategic partnerships with organizations that promote and advocate women's involvement. And we fund capacity building activities and provide technical assistance to such endeavors. Next, how can we ensure effective inclusion mechanisms and establish firm links between Track 1 and Track 2? And in many processes, the inclusion mechanism that bridges these tracks takes the form of a gender subcommittee, for example. And we see that to be effective, the subcommittee's members need to have sufficient influence and technical expertise, and ideally also close ties to the parties as such. Members need to remain in steady contact with the populations they represent so that they can have the input and the backing that they need to really make their voices heard. And while no perfect model exists, we have learned that such mechanisms can be effective from the Colombian Subcommission on Gender, for example, and the Syrian Women's Advisory Board and others. In January, Norway will take up its seat on the Security Council as a non-permanent member. And promoting the inclusion of women in peace processes is one of our top priorities in this context. And we look very much forward to work closely with the UK and Kenya and Mexico and the other UN member states on this topic. And we will focus on providing practical and concrete input to negotiations, work with the informal expert group on women, peace and security, and invite women peace builders to brief the Council. And we will also work to increase the security of women peace builders and human rights defenders. And we look forward to working with all of you in forwarding that agenda also going forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments, and of course for Norway's continuing pledge to engage on women, peace, and security work, including on the strategic partnership level. So this brings us just about to the end of our discussion. I do want to say, however, that we have some results which we will pull out into some graphics that we will be able to share later via our social media channels. But if we could, I think we wanted to have all of our participants who are here still, if we can have you all for a photo that we could take as a family photo while I'm reading out the results of there we go. So if everybody could turn their videos back on, and my colleagues can take a group photo of us. So the responses that we've had are really interesting, and I'll just give a little bit of a snapshot of who did particularly well in what areas. Emily did particularly well in terms of the potential to provoke change, closely followed up by innovation and practicability. Betty did particularly well on affordability, which goes to show, I think, that it's a matter of, in many ways, of political will. We then had Yasmin doing particularly well across the three issues of practicability, affordability, and potential to provoke change. And then Daniela did particularly well on innovation and practicality. So some really interesting results, and we'll certainly share those with the participants here today as we get those results in and have them in a digestible format. With all of that being said, I just want to thank you all so much. This has been really an incredibly inspiring conversation. I've loved the generosity of spirit with which you all came into the conversation and engaged with each other. So I do think that it was super interesting and inspiring, and I certainly am looking forward to following up on these ideas. This goes for our Women Peace Builders, to our expert panel, to our senior ministerial representatives. So thank you to all the partners. We do have an obligation to find more creative ways to, as clearly came out here today, to look for inclusive processes, but truly about inclusive outcomes, and to work together to achieve those outcomes. We really need to reframe the way that so many of us talk and think about that. So on our part, from Inclusive Peace, we are launching, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are launching a new initiative called Rethinking, Rethinking Inclusive Peace, to try to do that work together. And so we're really looking forward to all of you working with us and for us to work with you on those innovative efforts. That is all from me, apart from saying, I hesitate to say happy Women, Peace and Security anniversary, but in solidarity for the Women, Peace and Security anniversary, it is really wonderful to see you all. And again, thank you so much for being here with us. And with that, I'll close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.